Okay, well, last week we were just getting into the middle part of chapter 2. We were talking about the prophets, and it's interesting that Micah talks about prophets quite a bit, more than once here in the various chapters, about what they were doing, what they weren't doing, and so on. But my Bible even calls that section the lying prophets, and we talked about that a little bit. And then we were getting ready to go to a question, but we kind of held off. So I wanted to pick up on it a little bit here, though, to talk about Micah. And it's interesting because the good prophets were being lied on or criticized and things, and nobody was listening to them. And then there were the false prophets that were going around telling their prophecies and doing their things, and they were just, we'll talk about that more, but they weren't doing what they should be doing, and those that were doing what they should be doing weren't being listened to. So Micah starts off to talk about the prophets and everything. This will be chapter 2, verses 8, I believe, is kind of where I'm going into. But he dwells upon the continuing greed of the people as well as the prophets, and he talks about how that they would not only were they so greedy and stuff that when they would steal clothing from people, not only did they take their coat, well, they took all their clothes or whatever. It says that they took both the cloak or the robe with the garment, and that was more or less saying the cloak with the coat. To me, a cloak and a coat's the same thing, but when you decipher Hebrew, you get a little bit oddities. But basically, they just weren't happy with stealing a single item. They were taking everything. He points out that nobody was immune, that they were taking houses away from women and orphans and so on. And usually they're the easiest prey. I mean, it's like that in the wild, that wolves, will go after the slowest, weakest, and eldest and stuff like that when they're hungry. So they're saying that the people of Israel and Judah and the prophets and the leaders and so on weren't any different. That nobody was immune from being mistreated. And all this time, the Lord is kind of requiting them or criticizing them for their cruelty to the poor and defenseless. But he's starting to make it clear that, eventually this is all going to come back to them, that they're going to have their own time of trouble and imminence, and that they're going to be expelled from the land in which they polluted as well. Michael goes on to say that, more or less, that now is not the time of rest. Let me find that. Arise and depart, for this is not your rest. That's the verses that are more or less saying, you're going to be leaving this. You're not going to have time to rest because you're getting ready to get exiled and things. So you can't just lay around on your couch or whatever and continue to steal. You're about to be punished. And this one verse, in at least my Bible, study Bible, kind of described this. It says, with intense sarcasm, Micah said the people deserved the false prophecy they received. And that one kind of confused me a little bit, because I guess at least that explanation confused me, because most of the false prophets were just doing prosperity gospels, and they weren't criticizing people and that kind of stuff for their sins and their iniquities. They were just telling them what they wanted to hear. And so it's kind of makes me wonder how the Bible came out with Micah said that people deserve the false prophecy. But what it really comes down to is it's kind of like what we read with all the previous prophets, that they basically wanted a religion that satisfied their self-indulgence. They didn't want to be told that they were doing wrong or that they were sinning and that they were going to pay a price for it. They were opposed to a religion that demanded righteousness and holiness. And, but every one of these verses, you can say, it sounds a lot like it is today. That's just that's what they were groomed or what they grew up into, and that's what they continue to do it. So for this reason, the false prophets basically, like I said, they just told the people what they wanted to hear, and they only preached prosperity. And
hey, Ken.
Yes.
Hey, so we're having a side discussion, and I just want to know if you have insight to it. So how did they become prophets? Were they self-appointed? Were they Satan appointed? Like at what point were they known as prophets, but obviously false? But like real prophets were God appointed. So how did these people, they just started telling lies and people started listening and then they just became prophets?
Yeah. What I've gathered in some of the previous books is that like in Samaria and things, all of the real priests and everything, which probably likely would have become the prophets of the time and things. And, I've thought about this inside my head. I mean, to some degree, anybody that reads the Bible and tells it to somebody else in a way is a prophet. But I think when you become a prophet or whatever, you are somehow, back then at least, you were somehow recognized or appointed. And in Israel, when all the priests left, the leadership and the kings of Israel actually appointed or pulled people out of the crowd and made them into priests and prophets and so on. And in Judah, assuming that there were probably a few self-appointed prophets as well too. I mean, you think about, we're all supposed to be God called and that kind of stuff to become pastors and things like that. But you have to believe that there are people that have taken it upon themselves and decided they wanted to be a pastor or of some sort. So my guess is that's probably what happened back then as well too. Those who weren't appointed, that were false prophets, did it on their own. Perhaps because they saw the opportunity, the money, and so on. So that's the best answer I have.
Yeah. Well, actually, nobody particularly appoints a lot of these pastors that are on TV today,
right?
As far as they're concerned.
Yeah, a lot of them are because their father was a preacher or whatever. And if you've read if you've read the history of Joel Osteen, his father was actually the pastor of that church, and he had no desire to follow in his footsteps and that kind of stuff. But in his books and stuff, he said that his dad was starting to fail in health and everything, that he was called by God to fill that. So you'd like to think that anybody that becomes a pastor was called by God. And it's hard to put, unless there's a glowing light or something, it's hard to tell sometimes if it's just, did you have a bad dinner that night and couldn't sleep or what? But yeah, you're right, Keith.
Yeah.
So I guess the answer to like a lot of our questions, Laura, is we're not 100% certain, but that this is what's more than likely how a lot of this happened. So, but yeah, today, nobody ever really appoints somebody other than God, I would think.
Yeah. Or they appoint themselves just like they did back then. And then some people will listen.
Yeah.
And how many of them appoint themselves still wanting to be good and do it right and stuff, but then get led astray and things, and or how many went into it for the wrong reason and then turned it around and began actually seeing miracles and helping people,
Yeah, that's true.
could be a lot of either. So that kind of leads us right into question 1 here. It says, chapter 2 includes the beginning of passages that appear to call out the false prophets. What are some modern day equivalents in this arena that we might experience? So, and we don't necessarily have to think of false prophets as just being religious to some degree. I mean, there are people that prophesy about anything and everything under the sun. So, this is wide open. This could be a long discussion itself, and we've had a lot of these conversations before about anybody that preaches the prosperity gospel, could be kind of considered a false prophet. But
Right.
any others that we can think of? This is not really in the area of religion, but sometimes the climate change or people, can be spinning a prophecy or whatever. And
Yeah.
sometimes they take certain bits. We've talked about how people can interpret and take pieces of the Bible out and make it fit an occasion. There was one time when AOC came out and said that if we don't do something, the world's going to end in 12 years. Well, she actually pulled that out of a report that said, if we don't do something, the decline will start in 12 years, or the point of possibly no return may start in 12 years. But it wasn't that the earth was going to literally end in 12 years. So, but that was a prophecy that, I would say anybody with a microphone is capable of being a false prophet, whether it be media or anything else. Sometimes there's honest mistakes. Sometimes it's, who knows?
We had a couple of examples on our end. Logan said Darwin. So that's an idea of, someone taking a stand on something and people listening that's probably not on point. And then Mike and I went to a church last weekend on the beach, and we enjoyed the church. We enjoyed the message. It was old Baptist hymns, so I enjoyed the music. We got back in the golf cart and I said, Mike, what do you think that denomination was? And he said, Doomsday. Because the preacher was sure that we were in the 7-year period in Revelation, and kept giving examples of how we were, and that it was a be ready sermon, which was a very good sermon. The be ready sermon was good, but his examples he talked about when you're driving out to the Keys in Florida, there's a bar right before the long bridge that's the last stop. And he's like, so if you need gas or beer, that's the place. You got to stop right there. And he was talking about how there's no more chances after that, and we are at the last stop. And so, I mean, his message was good, but he was really sure where we were in the timeline of Revelation. And I just don't know if we can be so sure about that.
But you see, we're supposed to have a period of peace before the tribulation, or the real bad things start happening. So that to me is,
we're not there. Yeah.
No.
Keith, I really thank you for saying that, because I really miss Marie's perspectives and her helping see things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise about happenings in the Middle East, and just her knowledge of that. And so anytime you have that, please feel free to share, because you are so full of wisdom that I like to hear it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And you know, there's been periods of time in our history where, you know, you could almost assume that we've had periods of peace, but then you got to get down deep into the scriptures and stuff. And Mike is a good example. Is it says that not only will we have periods of peace, but we will all become one nation. Well, that's the part we haven't done yet.
Right.
And things as well. And we've had cold wars and times when people weren't fighting or hurling insults and bombs and that kind of stuff, but we haven't got to the point where all of the Islamic nations and all of the Chinese and the Japanese and all the other different denominations around the world, they haven't all come together to accept God as their savior. And if that has to happen, you know, it might be a while. But you know, can the pastor be absolutely certain that we're in that time frame? No, I don't think that. But there are so many things going on in our world where you could almost make that connection that it certainly seems like it sometimes. So
yeah,
but to actually tell people, I mean, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Everybody marvels about Nostradamus and stuff, about some of the things that he predicted came true. And I'm like, the man made thousands of predictions, and yet we focus on a handful. I can write down on a piece of paper that in the future a meteor is going to crash into the earth and knock it off course or whatever. And in the next 8,000 years, that could happen. Am I a prophet that predicted that? So what?
yeah.
So, you know, what's the saying that even a blind squirrel will find an acorn once in a while, or a broken clock is right 2 times a day, or whatever. You know, it's hard to. Now, what I will say is the good part of the message is we need to be ready, whether this is the time or not and stuff, because it doesn't say how long all nations will come together. You know, if it doesn't necessarily, at least I don't think, and Keith can correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
I mean, then all nations may come together for 24 hours before the earth dies, you know? So with everything that's going on in the world with nuclear weapons involved in so many wrong hands, you know, it only takes Satan's nudge or a bad ego and stuff to pull that trigger. So, okay, the last part of chapter 2 then starts off talking about the promise of restoration and things. Like we said, the false prophets preached that God's judgment would not fall upon the people, but you know, Micah was telling them otherwise. Micah was the false prophets were more or less just saying, you know, hey, keep paying your money, keep doing your sacrifices, keep doing what you're doing. God is on our side. We're in the temple. We're fine. The reason you're doing so well is because God is with us and things. And Mike is telling people, you know, that you are going to be punished and that kind of stuff, but there will be restoration on the backside. And Micah does that several times in his book and stuff. So we'll see another one here in a little bit. But Micah also promised salvation that would occur beyond the judgment for the righteous remnant. And a lot of the prophets use that word remnant, meaning that it's a very small piece of the whole, that are still true believers and that kind of stuff, even though they're surrounded by a mass of non-believers. And the scriptures describe it a little bit further in saying that God would gather the good sheep like a good shepherd or whatever. He's going to pull the flock together, and together the righteous masses led by God would push forth and break through the gate that's holding them in, and their king, the Lord God himself, would lead them from exile and take them home. And so it's starting to share the punishment of exile with them, albeit he's kind of already predicted a lot of that for the Israelites in Assyria. He's starting to lay the framework or the groundwork for what could happen to the people of the South as well too. Chapter 3, then Micah starts calling out people. He starts off in the very beginning calling out the rulers or the leaders, the kings and so on. It said that these leaders should put things into a rightful state. You would think that most leaders would be doing after years of what works and what doesn't work and stuff. You would think that they would be trying to create, Mayberry or whatever in the Middle East or whatever, trying to create a place of peace and restore shalom and wholeness. But instead, Micah saw rulers who were perverting justice. They were, again, using their power, giving favors to their buddies and things like that, allowing people to steal and do evil things. And Micah goes on to describe several verses or whatever that could be taken as cannibalistic. It says, who strip the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, flay their skins from them, break their bones, chop them in pieces like meat for the pot, like flesh for the cauldron. So he's describing practices of, one could say, like wild animals, eating their prey, or perhaps a butcher that is cleanly, processing meat or preparing it for meat. But it's more or less just, I guess the people are being treated like meat, so to speak, rather than a brother or a sister or a family member. But then Micah goes on and say, but someday they will seek the Lord, and because of their actions, God will ignore them and turn their back. It says, but then they will cry to the Lord, but he will not hear them. He will even hide his face from them at that time because they have been evil in their deeds. So God's going to say, you didn't listen to me. I'm not going to listen to you at this point. Then in verse 5, Mike starts turning his message to the fake prophets or the false prophets. He points out that while they're preaching peace, they're leading the people into mistakes about matters of government and religion. It goes on to say, who chant peace while they chew with their teeth, but who prepare war against him who puts nothing into their mouths. A few of the commentators that I've listened to and podcasts and so on says, basically the prophets are giving out what they're getting. He says that, if you were good to the prophets, you gave them money and everything that they would tell them, you're going to do well, you're going to prosper and all that kind of stuff. They would tell the people exactly what they wanted to hear. We've said that before. And if the people weren't supporting the prophets, maybe they weren't as supportive, they might have criticized them or complained or didn't support their ministries, so to speak. They weren't necessarily telling them the positive things. They were telling them the negative things and probably not helping them out in any way. So, it's almost like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And like I said, the prophets only told the people what they expected to hear or what they wanted to hear. They weren't preaching the sin and the iniquity and you need to change your ways or else you're going to be punished. And that's the thing that is severely lacking in a lot of religions and ministries on TV and everything today. Verse 6, Micah goes on, he tells the prophet that their day of illumination and vision are over. It took me a while to get to that point in reading several things, but it says, therefore you shall have night without vision. You shall have darkness without divination. The sun shall go down on the prophets and the day shall be dark for them. You know, they were supposed to be the enlightened ones and had the vision to see into the future and everything. And Micah is saying, you know, those days are over and that there is a day of darkness coming. And when it falls on you, it's going to stay there. You're not going to prosper anymore. And what Micah is saying that when this happens, the people are now going to see that those prophets got it wrong. You know, they weren't telling the truth. And then these prophets will be ashamed. They'll be silenced because even if they did say something, nobody's going to listen to them. The people will see that, you know, that the prophets, not only do they not have an answer from God now, they never had it in the first place. You know, they never, even though they're supposed to be delivering God's message and visions, they got it wrong, and justifiably, they were going to lose their position of honor because the people were not going to believe them anymore. This next question, and I don't necessarily come up with all these questions. I find places where there are different, but man, some of them really ring true. Chapter 3, Micah calls out the wicked rulers and the hypocritical prophets. And it says, give examples in which people today expect God's blessings despite their rebellion against him. And that should have been a capital H, but so I got two really good examples. So, but I'm going to wait and see if anybody else comes up with them. Some of them are very alive in the news today. Now you're all going to wait. You're going to wait for me.
I think there are government officials who expect God's blessing despite the fact that they are actually oppressing the poor.
Yep. That's a good one. I will take that one even further, and I'm going to name names.
Okay.
Does anybody follow the diocese out in California that is refusing to give Nancy Pelosi communion because of her position on abortion?
Yes.
Yeah. And the diocese out in San Francisco said, we cannot give communion to you because you still support abortion, not just abortion in general, but abortion up to the 9th month and that kind of stuff. So I thought, that's a pretty good example of somebody actually calling somebody out who's asking for blessings and forgiveness of their sins and stuff when they openly in front of everybody else express their sins. Any others? I just, not naming names, but I was just thinking of anybody that's in a church leadership or whatever, whether it's priests, Baptists, or anybody that continues to abuse children and commit adultery and different things while every Sunday, though, they're still up there on the pulpit preaching righteousness.
Yeah.
So this is one that, it's not quite as obvious and public and stuff as the first one, but there's many out there that.
Lars says we all do it. We all, sin every day and then expect God's blessings.
Right. Yeah.
To an extent. So.
To an extent, yeah, you're correct. Yeah, it's just it's some you expect more from, I guess, so to speak. But yeah, you're right. So yeah, and we go to church to be forgiven and things, and as long as I think one of the big differences is are we confessing, and are we repenting after we do it and things, or are we having press conferences and so on? So I think that's one of the big differences. Okay, moving on in chapter 3, then in verse 5, Micah describes himself. I thought this was interesting, is, Micah's sitting here calling out bad prophets, and he probably said, hey, wait a minute, I'm a prophet. I got to be careful here. I need to distinguish myself. I need to tell the difference between them and myself. So in verse 5, Micah, oh, wait a minute, not verse 5. Wait a minute. Did I get that wrong? It's verse 8. I'm sorry. In verse 8, Micah describes himself as a faithful witness, distinctly different from the others. It says, but truly, I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of justice and might. So he's trying to say, look, I'm a voice. I'm a powerful voice. I'm here to tell you that you're sinning, you're going to be punished, and yet there's going to be redemption and stuff. He's not like the other prophets. This is what he's trying to tell them. He preached against transgression and sin, but dealing with issues that really couldn't be resolved until the people confessed and abandoned their sins. And in verses 9 through 11, Micah described, he kind of goes back to the leaders again, and he describes leaders who are corrupt, yet still trust in God's presence and blessing. It's like, hey, we've been doing this for years. God hasn't punished us. He hasn't struck us down. Look, we're in his temple. We're celebrating life. We're one with God and everything. Just because the lightning bolt didn't come down and hit them on the head, they felt like they're doing okay. So he's telling them that, God's punishment, is eventually going to come. And like I said, these people saw Jerusalem and the temple of signs and irreversible right standing with God. So it's almost like, like I said, I'm not condemning or chastising religions, but there are some religions where it's okay to sin as long as you show up on Sunday and do your repentance and your confessions and give your donations and everything and your Hail Marys. So, Micah might be trying to point that. He continues on. And like I said, they've gotten along with their behavior so long, they didn't see their actions as being unholy. The verses then include several lines that describe bribery and basically selling of the services. It says, and Jerusalem with iniquity, her heads judge for a bribe, her priests teach for pay, and her prophets divine for money. So he's saying, you're all in this for the money. More or less, and you're not doing it because you're a man of God and you're righteous and different things. Verse 12 then goes on to describe total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, much like what fell on Samaria. It talks about how the mountain is basically going to be stripped down to bare hills of the forest. So everything that they built up on the Temple Mount, everything is predicted to be gone. And this was the interesting part. And I think I kind of said this in the beginning. It's believed by many. Remember, we said there was a good king, a bad king, and then a good king. We think that a lot of Micah's prophecies were given during the middle king, the bad king. And many scholars believe that it was Micah's sermons that spurred King Hezekiah to reform Jerusalem, which might have bought them some time. It postponed God's judgment. And just looking up Hezekiah, it says Hezekiah enacted sweeping religious reforms that included a strict mandate for the sole worship of Yahweh and a prohibition on venerating any other deities within the temple of Jerusalem. So he kind of cleaned out the church, kind of like Jesus did when he had his day. He he said, look, no more are we going to worship all these other false gods and that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he said, you can probably do that at home all you want. What you do in your own house is fine. But when you come into this temple, you're going to worship one God, and we're not going to make any bones about it. And possibly, that you could almost see that in our today, that depending on who's in the White House, sometimes it's cool to be a Christian, and other times you're not even allowed to bring up God and that kind of stuff. So it just depends a lot on your leaders and that kind of stuff. Going to try to get through. Oh, I got 15 minutes left. I got plenty of time. I can slow down. Chapter 4, I'm only going to get through probably the first 10 verses because that's all I wrote. Chapter 4, in my opinion, though, kind of takes a lot to understand. Just to give you a broad brushstroke, it starts out by talking about this reform or this return to God, but then it goes back to a dark place of okay, but not yet and stuff. So I had to read a lot of different commentaries and stuff to get some opinions and everything. But for the most part, chapter 4 is a lot about a message of hope. However, there are some warnings and some not so fast moments built into it. And probably the best commentary that I found to help me understand it said the key to the understanding is that the message of hope that Micah has delivered is still future, even to us as well. The time that Micah is describing, like we just talked about a little bit ago, about the time of peace and all nations, that hasn't happened yet. So that is still future to us as well. And that until that happens, all of God's people and us as well are going to suffer sooner or later prior to that time. Some people may feel like they're suffering now or they've suffered in the past. Maybe we haven't fully realized the wrath yet and things, but I think it's key to, when you read chapter 4, to know that this is a very long-term prophecy that Mike is giving for. And the keys to that, like we said, is God will one day establish himself as the one true ruler over his people and all nations and stuff. And but then you'll see other verses kind of go back in here about worshiping other false little g gods and that kind of stuff. But chapter 4 then also says the law and the word of the Lord will come forth from Jerusalem for everyone. So Jerusalem is predicted to be the throne from which we will all someday worship our God prior, during the time of peace, prior to final judgment. So I think we're hopeful that everything goes well, that we'll see the signs and that kind of stuff. But again, that doesn't mean we can sin right up to that time. Chapter 4 then goes on and more or less says God will be the one true judge over all people as well. The other time of the other verses in here that describe a time of no more war, verses 3 and 4 talks about that because there's no war or no threat of war, that instruments of death will be remade and promoting life. This kind of goes back to our discussion about, well, we have had time of peace, but we were still, in some degree, we were still in a war. We just called it a Cold War. And none of our leaders were beating their plowshares or their swords into plowshares. We still had a well-armed military. Everybody still had nuclear weapons and everything. We were just holding our finger above the button in case somebody flinched. So what this chapter is these first 10 verses are trying to describe as well too, is that um, it's going to be so peaceful and that kind of stuff that everybody will be able to dismantle their nuclear weapons and get rid of their tanks and their bombers and weapons and guns. And verse 4 goes on to say, but everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. This is basically saying while we're at peace, everyone can sit fearlessly amongst their possessions. We don't have to be guarded and stuff. And, I talk about this a lot about, what I thought it was like back in the late 60s, early 70s when, there was, communities were like Mayberry. I said, imagine a time when our kids could roam the streets freely without fear of being picked up or abused or anything, and we could all leave our doors unlocked and stuff while we were home and when we were away. I mean, half the time we didn't lock our doors and everything because everybody was pretty honorable back then. Verse 5 then is the one that I think kind of is a little bit confusing because it kind of goes back. It says, for all people walk each in the name of his God, little g God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So my study Bible kind of explained that says, though outnumbered by unbelievers, faithful worshipers promise to follow Yahweh forever. Well, if this is a continuation of the verses before that, when we're going to have a time of peace, that's a time when all people are supposed to be coming together as one. I'm not sure if people would still be, is this describing the deity followers prior to that time? That was a confusing part or whatever, but I think the message is pretty much is that eventually we're all going to come together, shun other gods and everything, get rid of the internet and all that stuff, and worship God for eternity.
I think this is describing the way it will be in the millennium. There will be a lot of unbelievers still in the millennium.
Yeah, well, and that's true. And will they be the majority? If you look around today, you have to think that there's going to be a lot of unbelievers.
Yeah, there could be, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and there's a place and a bus for them as well too, right?
Yeah. The fact that they're unbelievers doesn't mean that they're going to be committing all kinds of sin.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can be a pure agnostic atheist or whatever, and just focus on yourself and your false deities and the 10 things we came up with on finance and worship and yourself and that kind of stuff. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're out there stealing, committing evil, abusing people, but you get to ride on the bus with those people. So
right.
So finishing up here then, verse 6 then kind of starts off describing Zion's future triumph. It says, whether they've been, God says, and those whom I have afflicted, I will make the lame a remnant and the outcast a strong nation. And I wasn't 100% clear on why he was dividing up the lame from the outcast. You would think that the lame and the outcast, are kind of like the same group of people been afflicted. And one commentator has even said, some of these afflictions came about by others. It came about by the evil leaders and everything. But, we've talked many, many times before how even if God didn't directly do certain things, he allowed it to happen and he knew it was going to happen. So even though it wasn't directly attributed to God, it could be to some degree attributed to God just because those are his people and he allowed it to happen. But it says, from this godly remnant, he will build a strong nation. And Micah repeats, kind of the same message over and over again, that God's going to reign over them in Mount Zion forever. So for the believers, for the people that do come together, for the nations that do join in and that kind of stuff, you have to think that in order for a nation to come together, at least the leaders of that nation are either going to have to become believers or they're going to have to be overthrown by believers. So maybe that'll be some of our first signals when we see Christians start taking over China or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But how else are Islamic nations and that kind of stuff going to come together and believe in a one true God with the types of current leaderships that spew hate and death that we have now? So like I said, hopefully we'll see that as a sign as well. Reading through a lot of different things, one Bible scholar has even interpreted verse 8. Verse 8 says, "And you, O tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come, even the former dominion shall come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem." I don't remember this gentleman's name, but he had interpreted verse 8 to be a reference to the coming Messiah. And I can kind of read between the lines and see how he's coming up with that. It's a bit of a stretch, but the phrase, "O tower of the flock," is believed, and this is believed by many, to be a reference to a region or an area called Migdal Eder, which is in Bethlehem. And because he said, "To you it shall come, even the former dominion shall come," they're trying to make the case that this is one of the early signs of the early predictions of the Messiah, and that it's coming to Migdal Eder, which is a part of Bethlehem, that possibly this was the birthplace of Christ. And the former dominion, when you think of dominion, it's dominate. And so the former leadership or the former kingdom that we're referencing here is the days of David and Solomon, when they were truly, when all nations were together at that, or I shouldn't say all nations, but when Israel and Judah were combined, and they all were led by godly kings. But as we know, that got lost over time between different splits and everything else. So that's what that references to. Closing out then, this is the part of the chapter 4 where Micah starts describing suffering and stuff again. It's like, not so fast. I'm telling you, this is what's going to happen when things are going to be great, a time of peace, and you can just go sit under your fig trees. But he says that's a future hope. But what you need to know is that you're going to suffer first. And it's not going to be a minor suffering or whatever. Micah points out that, it's almost a little bit of Micah's attitude or sarcasm here. It says, "Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in your midst? Is your counselor perished?" He's kind of pointing out is, you went your way and it's not going to go so well, and then you're going to cry. And so he's like, but you don't have a right to cry. You chose your path and you turned away from God. He didn't turn away from you. They were the ones that had forgotten Yahweh, who was their true king and counselor. So he's pointing that out, that, you not only you're going to cry, suffer, and cry, you got no one to blame but yourself. And then verse 10, then God uses a childbirth metaphor to really paint a picture of suffering that is going to be followed by the eventual joy. He talks about pangs of labor and so on. But so what he's trying to describe here is that you're going to suffer, but then you're going to come out of that very well with a true prize in the thing. But what's interesting here, this is probably the first time that Babylon has been mentioned by any of the minor prophets. It says Micah then describes their travel to Babylon. It says, "From now you shall go forth from the city, you shall dwell in the field, and to Babylon you shall go. There you shall be delivered. There the Lord will redeem you." And if you stop there, this sounds like a vacation trip. You're just going to go to you're going to go to Babylon for a while. He doesn't really tell them why they're going to Babylon or what they're going to experience and stuff. But the final sentence says, "There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies."
Yeah.
So that's the first clue that maybe this is not going to be such a pleasant trip. And I think we've all had vacation trips like that, but where we felt like we ran into enemies and stuff. But he's telling them that you're going to go to Babylon, and there I'm going to deliver you and redeem you. So that brings us to our final question. So what, prior to this verse, what was the dominant empire at the time of Micah? In that whole region, who was the most powerful nation that everybody feared?
Assyria, wasn't it?
Yeah, Assyria. Who did they predict was going to take over Israel? Was the Assyrians. So one would think that, well, if they're the most powerful nation, they're going to come in and take Israel. They've already predicted, that they're going to come in and take some of the cities and stuff. You would assume that the Assyrians were going to be coming to Jerusalem and get that as well too. So the question, what is surprising about the fact that he says they will go into captivity in Babylon? Well, I think just the fact that he says they're going to Babylon is surprise enough. But any thoughts or ideas about why maybe they're going to Babylon instead of Assyria, I guess? I wondered if it was the difference between the two nations. Judah and Jerusalem tried to lead a godly existence and stuff. They tried to follow God, and they had good leaders and bad leaders. Israel couldn't really say that. Israel really kind of followed the bad way, or the black sheep of the family, so to speak. They were so unhappy with the priests and the godly nations that they created their own temples and stuff. And so I wonder, and also too, God made a promise to David that he would preserve them and that they would rise again. So I wondered if this kid gets to go to Golden Corral buffet, but this kid gets to go to Subway. Well, one was treated a little bit better than the other in my mind. I haven't done a lot of deep research into Babylon, but I don't think that the Babylonians led them off with fish hooks in their lips and stripped them naked and things like that. I haven't found where they went to probably the place on earth that was closest to hell, so to speak, where the Israelites did go to Assyria, where they were skinned, butchered, tortured, raped, flayed, you name it. Everything under the sun, evil, could happen to them. And just reading ahead a little bit, in the Bible, God had to come in and wipe out the Assyrians in order to free the people from there, where in Babylon, the Persians took over Babylon and said, "You can go home now." I mean, they gave them their possessions and everything else. So I'm thinking Babylon is, the restaurant was probably a poor analogy, but compare the Russian gulags to the Jackson County jail system. You know, there's probably two differences here, or federal penitentiaries versus the fenced in resorts that, you know, politicians get to go to. I felt like Babylon was a lesser punishment, I guess, was where I was heading with this. So
Yeah.
any thoughts on that, maybe? Well,
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that.
yeah. Yeah, that's they, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure they suffered. I mean, being kicked
Oh,
out of your
yeah.
home and losing your possessions and going to a foreign land and being a slave. I mean, if anybody carried the stories and tales from Egypt all the way through these years, they were about to be put back in the position that they were in Egypt before God made his promises to them. So that's my thoughts. Okay, next week, you don't really need to read your study guide, but I'm hoping to cover verses 4:11 through 5:15. Earlier I said we probably have 2 more weeks. I think we'll have 3 weeks. I'm going to try and get these verses done next week, then chapter 6 1 week, and then chapter 7 the next week. So 3 weeks from now, hopefully we'll be all wrapped up. But this next section begins to lay out God's plan of ultimate redemption, including and he goes into more detail about the Messiah and the judgment on Israel's enemies. So with that,